Hi all, Professor Wirt. So this video is going to be a quick run through the integumentary model for the AP1 lab. So that's the model that you see here. This model is actually divided into three panels that are going to represent the skin from three different parts of the body. So what we have is the left panel here is what is referred to as glabrous or thick skin. Thick skin is perfectly fine as an answer in the AP1 lab. And thick skin is associated with the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, so the palmar or plantar regions. On the other end of this model, you have what is called thin skin, and this is thin skin that is coming from most of the rest of the body. It is labeled on the model as coming from the scalp, but it could easily be coming from regions of the skin around the arms or the legs, or so on and so forth. So the middle panel here is also thin skin. And this middle panel is labeled the axillary region, meaning it is coming from the armpit. It is going to be representative of skin that is coming from regions of secondary sexual development that have novel hair growth as a consequence of somebody going through puberty. So this would be the regions of the armpit, but it could also be the regions around the genitalia or the anus or the inguinal regions. So as we go through the anatomy of each one of these panels in detail, we'll talk about how to tell whether it is thin or thick skin, and we'll talk about how to tell if it is thin skin, whether it is coming from a region of secondary sexual development or whether it is coming from some other random place on the body. It is a common question, though, on a practical exam or on a quiz to have a piece of skin put up and then ask the question, is it thin or is it thick? So looking at the whole model, though, the integument gets divided up into three large regions. So there is the region that is from the surface of the skin to this wavy orange line that is going all across the model. And this region from the surface to that wavy orange line represents the epidermis, which is the most superficial layer of the integument. From this lighter color all the way down to where you start to see this yellow bubbly stuff, this region here is the dermis. The dermis is going to have most of the anatomy that you are going to be responsible for naming. That includes a lot of glandular structures. It includes the hair with its associated follicle. It includes a lot of other things that we are going to point out as we go along. So below the dermis, you have this region here that is marked by the presence of this yellow bubbly tissue. That yellow bubbly tissue is adipose tissue. Once you start to see large concentrations of adipose tissue in the integument, you have reached a region of the integument called the hypodermis. For what it's worth, the term epidermis literally just means above the dermis. The term hypodermis literally just means below the dermis. And so those two structures are just named for their placement relative to this large portion of the integument here. So the combination of the epidermis and the dermis is sometimes referred to as the cutaneous membrane. The hypodermis sometimes goes by a different name, the subcutaneous region, because it is literally below the cutaneous membrane, and that's what subcutaneous means. So looking first at thick skin is called thick skin because of two modifications in the epidermis that are not present in thin skin. So the first modification is that if you look at the most superficial component of the epidermis, it is much, much thicker in thick skin than it is in thin skin. The other thing of note is that the epidermis has a layer in thick skin that is not present in thin skin. That is this little white layer here that is running underneath the most superficial layer of the epidermis. As we go along in this video, we will start naming the individual layers of the epidermis. And so we'll deal with the naming convention of these various layers at that point in time. The easiest way, though, to tell that you are looking at thick skin and not thin skin is to not look at the epidermis, but to actually look at the dermis. The dermis of thick skin is missing something that is present in both of our panels of thin skin, and that is the hair and its associated hair follicle. And this should kind of make sense because if you look at the bottom of your feet or the palms of your hands, usually there are no hair present in those regions of skin. And so by far the easiest way to determine whether you are looking at thin or thick skin is just ask yourself whether you see a hair or a hair follicle in the dermis. And if you do not, it is thick skin. Now, because of the absence of hair and hair follicles in thick skin, there's a lot less going on in the dermis here than there is in some of the other panels. But there are three structures that I am going to hold you responsible for knowing. The first one is this snarled tube here that has a duct that is sent all the way to the surface of the skin. So this is a particular gland that is called an eccrine sweat gland, and that is the only term that I will accept for this gland. Sometimes your lab manual or your book will refer to this as a merocrine gland, and that is not an acceptable answer for me. And so if you tell me merocrine gland, you are going to lose points. We'll talk in a lecture about why I do not consider that to be an acceptable term. So if I point at this thing on a practical exam and ask you to name it, the answer is it is an eccrine sweat gland. We'll talk about this structure in the lecture as producing sweat that is involved in controlling human body temperature. So for the glands that I am going to go through in this video, by the time we have gotten to it in lecture, I will expect you to know the function for the lab. And that means our first quiz, you don't have to worry about function, but by the time Practical 2 rolls around, you absolutely do. So the function of this structure is just to produce sweat. Now, this panel of thick skin has a slightly different representation of an eccrine sweat gland, and that's what you see here. This is what you would see if you sliced this gland longitudinally. This is a helpful depiction because this is actually what it looks like in the microscope slides, and we will deal with the microscope slides of the integument in a subsequent video. But when you slice through this snarled tubular gland here, what you get at the base of the gland is a bunch of little circles, and that is actually what you will be looking for on the microscope slide. On the microscope slide, because the duct of the gland that leads all the way to the surface of the skin tends to go in and out of the plane of section, you often won't see the duct. And so what I will typically label then is the very base of the gland, which will look like this. Now, the other two things that you are responsible for knowing in this thick skin panel are going to be two bundles of nervous tissue. So there are a collection of these bundles at the bottom of the dermis here that are getting close to the beginnings of the hypodermis. These larger structures here are what are called lamellated corpuscles, although sometimes a book will refer to them as Pacinian corpuscles. Either term is acceptable for me. Closer to the surface of the dermis, on the superficial side of things, you have smaller bundles of nervous tissue here. Those are what are referred to as tactile corpuscles or sometimes Meissner's corpuscles. Either term is acceptable for me. We will talk in the lecture at some point about the function of these structures. The tactile corpuscles are for sensing light pressure. The lamellated corpuscles are for sensing heavy pressure. When we get to that material in the lecture, you will also be responsible for the function in the lab. Not for the first quiz that we have on this material, but certainly by Practical 2. The tactile corpuscles here are named because they are associated with the sense of touch. Tactile just means touch. The lamellated corpuscles here are named because they have a layered texture to them. It doesn't really show up in the picture that I have for this video, but you can see the layering more clearly in the model itself. And the word lamella just means a layer. So corpuscle in both cases just means body, and that's because they are just a little body of nervous tissue encased in a surrounding sheath. So Switching panels now, what we are looking at is thin skin. And you can tell that it's thin skin because it has a visible hair and hair follicle embedded within the dermis. The hair itself is going all the way into the epidermis, at which point it would erupt through the skin. The other notable thing here is that the superficial layer of the epidermis is much thinner than it was in the previous panel, and you were missing that white layer that is immediately deep to the surface of the skin. So, having identified this panel then as thin skin, the next question becomes, is it thin skin from the regions of secondary sexual development, or is it thin skin from most of the rest of the human body? And so the way that you ascertain that is you look for a particular gland that is tied into the hair follicle that is called an apocrine sweat gland. And that apocrine sweat gland is what you see here. It has the same basic kind of snarled tube shape that the eccrine sweat gland does, but it tends to be much larger, and you can see that if you look at the whole model. And the duct goes to a different location. The eccrine sweat gland has a duct that goes to the surface of the skin. The duct of this apocrine sweat gland here goes to the hair follicle itself. And so that is the indication that you are looking at thin skin from a region of secondary sexual development. If you see an apocrine sweat gland, it is from a place like the armpit or the groin or the genitalia, or so on and so forth. Just like the eccrine sweat gland, if you cut through this gland longitudinally, you see that it will look like the depiction of the bottom half of this gland, where it is just a collection of circles. Now, looking at the hair follicle itself, what you can see is that the hair follicle is this region of orange tissue that surrounds the hair. This orange tissue has been shown as being actually continuous with the bottom layer of the epidermis, and that is significant because the actual bottom layer of the epidermis forms the hair follicle as it enters into the dermis itself. The hair follicle is what is going to give rise to the hair at the enlarged base of the hair at this hair bulb here. And the hair grows from this bottom region, and newly formed hair is pushed up and out of the hair follicle, where it will eventually erupt from the surface of the skin. Now, if you look at this panel, you will note that some of the structures that we saw in thick skin are absent from this model. For example, you do not see eccrine sweat glands, and you do not see our tactile corpuscles. Sometimes the absence of things is significant and sometimes it's not, and that makes it a little confusing for students. So the absence of tactile corpuscles is actually significant here. Tactile corpuscles are much more commonly associated with thick skin than they are with thin skin. The missing eccrine sweat glands, though, are not significant. You actually have eccrine sweat glands in thin skin. It is just not depicted in this panel for some reason, probably to avoid overly cluttering it. However, you can see some structures that we saw before in the panel of thick skin. For example, there is a lamellated corpuscle here. The lamellated corpuscle is actually shown as being nested within the beginnings of the hypodermis, and that's because they tend to be a little deeper in thin skin. Our last panel of skin is shown here, and so the first question should always be, is this thin or thick skin? The presence of a hair follicle here clearly indicates that this is thin skin. If you look at the hair follicle, there is not evidence of a coiled tubular gland that is linked into the hair follicle, meaning there is no apocrine sweat gland. And so that means that this is thin skin from regions that are not associated directly with secondary sexual development. So this is a more complete picture of the hair follicle and its associated hair, showing you layers of the anatomy here. That is not material that I'm going to hold you responsible for. You can see much more clearly, though, the enlarged bulb of the hair follicle. You can also see an inward fold here that houses a blood vessel. This is the hair root papilla here. this blood vessel is supplying all of the nutrients that the growing hair requires in order to engage actively in mitosis. We can see structures that we have seen in previous panels here as well. For example, there is a lamellated corpuscle nested within the beginnings of the hypodermis. There is also an eccrine sweat gland whose duct is depicted as going all the way to the surface of the skin. You can also see some new structures here as well. So, for example, there is a collection of bag-like glandular structures that are associated with a hair follicle. These bag-like glands are what are called sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands produce an oily secretion called sebum that is used to oil and lubricate the hair and the surface of the skin surrounding the hair. Sebaceous glands are present almost everywhere that you have hair follicles, and so even though they were not depicted in the thin skin from the axilla, you do have sebaceous glands in the thin skin from the axilla. Similarly, there is another structure that is associated with a hair follicle. That is this structure here that is in red, that is shown as connecting to both the hair follicle and the very bottom of the epidermal layer here. This is actually a muscle. This is what we would have referred to as smooth muscle back when we were talking about the 3 different types of muscle. The name for this muscle is an erector pilus muscle. And when you have goosebumps that cause your hair to stand up on end, that is the action of this muscle here. So erector pili are found almost everywhere that you have hair follicles, and that means despite the fact that they were not depicted in our thin skin from the axilla, you do have erector pili muscles in these regions, but it is only depicted on our model in the very last panel. So we'll close this video by going over the layers of the epidermis and then talking about the interface between the epidermis and the dermis. So this is a top-down view of the portion of the integumentary model that was dealing with thick skin. And so what you can see is that this region here has the entirety of the epidermis cut away, so that what you're looking at, these little mounds here, are regions of the dermis that are called dermal papillae. So the orange layer here that is shown layered on top of the dermis, this is the deepest layer of the epidermis, what's called the stratum basale. Stratum is another word for layer. Basale is referring to the bottom of something. It comes from the same origin that you get the word basement from, meaning at the bottom of something. The next layer that is shown is the stratum spinosum. It has a spiny-like texture, oftentimes in a histological preparation for a microscope slide, and that's what spinosum means. The next layer here is the stratum granulosum. The cells in the stratum granulosum have containers called granules inside the cells that will give this a distinct color in a histological preparation. My next layer here is the stratum lucidum. This layer will have a glassy-like texture when you look at it in a microscope slide, and that's what lucidum is referring to. My very last layer, and the thickest in thick skin, is the stratum corneum, and that is this layer here. If you view these layers at their profile, what you can see is that the wavy orange line here is the very deepest component of the epidermis. That is the stratum basale. The next layer here is the stratum spinosum. This kind of light orange here is the stratum granulosum. The white layer here is the stratum lucidum. And then the top layer that is shown cut off at the top, this is the stratum corneum. That is all in thick skin. If you look in thin skin, it looks very similar. There is a distinct wavy line here that represents the stratum basale, Again, the stratum basale merges into the tissue of the hair follicle. And superficial to the stratum basale, you have the stratum spinosum. Superficial to that, you have the stratum granulosum. Because this is thin skin, there is no stratum lucidum. There is a stratum corneum, but it is much thinner than it would be in thick skin. So the last thing of note is that the epidermis and the dermis are actually interlocked together by adjacent downward folds of the epidermis into the region of the dermis and upward folds of the dermis into the region of the epidermis. So the downward fold here of the epidermis is what is referred to as an epidermal ridge. This upward fold of the dermis is what is referred to as a dermal papilla. So a papilla is a word that we have seen before. It is a word that just means nipple. And so this forms a nipple-like protrusion upwards. So this alternating dermal papilla, epidermal ridge, dermal papilla, all down the length of the interface with the dermis and the epidermis helps to hold these things together and helps to aid in the movement of things back and forth between the dermis and the epidermis. There are also very frequently, if you look at the structure of the dermis, things that are embedded within the dermal papillae. For example, you see capillaries that are these small blood vessels, and these capillaries are feeding all of the surrounding tissues, including those of the epidermis. You also, if you go back to earlier panels, see that the tactile corpuscles, for example, are lodged in the dermal papillae as well.